Hey there, Redneck Preppy with you, and today a quick and dirty video on the dangers of reusing old brass. And I know this is going to be one of those self-evident things, but this is one of those do as I say, not as I do videos. So I've often proclaimed that hand loaders and reloaders are nature's best conservationists, because we're those idiots at the range that you see picking up our brass and other people's brass, take it home, process it, clean it, reuse it until finally it's no good no more, and we toss it into a bucket where it is recycled for posterity's sake. Sometimes, however, reloaders and hand loaders are tempted to keep using brass until it's not a good idea, or they don't carefully inspect their brass to see if they should continue using it. Now, this generally comes into play when you're shooting goofball calibers like I do. Things like 5.77 450 or 8x58 millimeter RD, 11 millimeter Mauser. Now, the reason why these are goofball calibers is because, one, the rifles that were manufactured to shoot these rounds haven't been produced, in some cases over a century, and two, the ammunition itself has not been produced either commercially or by a military in, again, quite possibly the same amount of time. So as reloaders, we are often tempted to keep using old brass, perhaps past the point that we should be, or we don't carefully inspect that brass before we reuse it. And I learned that lesson fairly recently when I had my 1871/84 Gewehr rifle out on the range. Now, the Gewehr 7184 fires the 11 millimeter Mauser round, or 43 Mauser as some people call it. It's a round that has not been commercially produced, as far as I could tell, since at least the 1960s, and it may be even more likely the 1950s. The last company that I'm aware of manufacturing it, at least in North America, is the Dominion Company, which was a Canadian company which shut down, I believe it was sometime in the 1970s, but I'm not entirely sure. So in order to keep my 7184 firing, I've had to do two things. One, I've sourced new brass, and I got some Bertram brass out of Australia a couple of years back that cost, I think it was $120 for 20 pieces of brass, and that's pretty darn expensive. Along the way, I've also managed to collect the occasional piece of old brass, generally Dominion brass, as this is. This is head stamped, yes, Dominion. 43M, 43 Mauser. Here it is. Now, why am I showing you this brass? And why am I doing this video? Well, I was at the range and I was shooting my hand loads for my 7184 when I heard a pop after pulling the trigger. There's two very dangerous sounds that you generally don't want to hear when you pull a trigger. One is an explosion, and you might not be around to hear it for very long, if you get my drift. And number two is the pop, which is generally the primer has gone off, but the powder has not ignited. So I sat there for up to 2 minutes, I think it was, waiting to see if, the powder would eventually go off. It didn't. So I removed the round, and on the face of it, nothing looked odd, other than that the bullet had pushed out about maybe 1/8 of an inch. So obviously the primer had gone off, the powder hadn't, but there was enough force from the primer going off to push the bullet out a little bit. And thank God it didn't get jammed in the barrel, because pounding out lead out of a barrel is awesome fun if you've never done it. It was after that I pulled the bullet out of the actual round that I started to figure out exactly what happened. And here are some pictures which I took at the range. So picture one, this is the round as is disassembled, and you see the heavily scratched up lead bullet that I had to basically pry out of the cartridge case. You notice in the middle, there's a big clump of powder there. and then all around it is scattered the rest of the powder. And there's also a couple of minor clumps here and there, as you can see, but it's basically that one big clump of powder. And that generally shows that the powder itself has become contaminated somehow. The interesting part, which I did not notice either chambering this round or even when I reloaded, and I'm going to assume that this damage was present before I actually attempted to fire the round off. You see this slit at the rim of the cartridge, and that was basically a hole in the cartridge that went about halfway around, so 180 degrees around. And I figured out fairly quickly that air had gotten in there, and perhaps some other contaminants, and basically messed up the powder, and that's why I had a failure to fire. Now in the second picture, that's a close-up, kind of a close-up, it seems a little blurrier than the first one was, of the hole, or the slit, however you'd like to refer to it as, in the near the rim, in the case body. And finally, just for comparison's sake, not that you wouldn't believe me because it's fairly self-evident, but you see to the right a normal 11mm Mauser cartridge with no hole at the rim, and beside it is the aforementioned case. This case, you can see it right here. I kept this case because I got a little shelf behind me where I put notable failures. So this is the 4th edition to that. Actually, I think it's the 5th, yeah, because I had a 303 bullet that I jammed into a barrel that I have up there as well. So here it is, the latest addition to the Hall of Shame. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, given that some brass, stuff like 11mm Mauser, a 577 450, or that 8x58 RD, and I mean a ton of other cartridges from yesteryear that only goofballs like me reload, we're tempted to keep reusing those old components over and over and over again because buying new stuff is really hard, or even impossible. I have been tempted by rifles where you can't even find the brass, and it's a rimfire, so good luck putting, ammunition together. So you do what I do, and you keep reusing this old stuff because, gosh darn it, you want to fire these rifles, and if you don't reuse the old stuff, or, spend the money to buy the new stuff, you ain't going to be shooting this rifle. And I don't collect rifles to put on walls. I shoot everything that I buy. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is, if you're going to use super old brass, and this is Dominion brass, so this is at least, if it was made in the 1960s, you're looking at 50 or 70 years old. Yeah, or 60 years old, sorry. You're looking at 60-year-old brass. I'm assuming that when I got this round, it wasn't a Dominion manufactured round. I'm pretty certain that this was brass somebody else had used after they shot their Dominion brass off. So this has gone through any number of firings, who knows how many, over the past 60 years. Now, if you shoot black powder out of the 11mm Mauser, which is what this was originally designed to do, you're going to be putting it through a different kind of pressure than you do smokeless powder. I use a reduced load for my smokeless powder rounds when I substitute for black powder, like I do in the 11mm Mauser, like I do in 8x58, and like I do in 577 450. So I don't stress the brass out too often. I know my new brass for 11mm Mauser from Bertram is going to last me many years and many firings because I don't stress that brass too hard. But this likely saw black powder loads, which probably stressed it much more. On top of that, who knows how the person before me or the people before me used these cases, if they were going full power or whatever it may be. So what I'm trying to tell you is, if you have the opportunity to get new brass to replace your old brass, take it. I know it's a heavy cost in some cases, particularly in something like this where you're paying $6, $7, $8 a case. 577 450 is not as bad. X-Ring down in the United States, I think you can get them for about $5 a case, which again, it's not great, but it's not horrible either. If you can replace old brass with new brass, do so. If you're going to use old brass like this 11mm Mauser from the 1950s or 60s. Who knows? And again, I'm assuming it's 60s. It could be even older than that. Carefully inspect all your brass before you load, after you fire, before you reload, after you reload. Inspect it multiple times, because at any moment this brass could fail. Obviously, during firing, it's subject to, tens of thousands of pounds per square inch of pressure. It could easily fail. At that point, toss it immediately. During reloading, the act of sizing this could pull this rim or cause this kind of failure that you saw in the pictures. It could literally pull and create this hole. You don't know. After you're done reloading, you've seated the bullet and all that stuff, inspect the cases again, because again, you never know. Maybe the seating of the bullet split the neck. I've had that happen with old 577 450 brass, where I seated a bullet in the neck and it immediately split the neck. Not because I don't know how to load 577 450, although you can accuse me of that if you want, but because the brass was old. I don't anneal, so the neck obviously was a little more brittle and the neck split. Had I not inspected that brass before I shot it, I might have been tempted to, or I would have used that in my rifle. And I mean, chances are nothing bad is going to happen other than a face full of gas. But I mean, you could always damage your rifle or yourself, which would be a really bad scene. Rifles can be replaced, you can't be. So be safe. So that is the gist of the video. When you're using really old components like brass in your goofball calibers, 577, well, I'm not going to name them all. You already heard me say them twice, 3 times. Inspect the cases at every single stage of loading to firing and make sure that those cases are still all right, because you never know when you're going to get one of these. And I got an awesome face full of smoke from my 11mm Mauser, my Gewehr 7184 that day. Turns out it doesn't smell quite as good as you would think it is. So be careful out there. Inspect your brass. Don't do what I do. Do what I say. At any rate, I hope your shots ring true. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you learned something, super duper, feel free to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, share it, do whatever you like. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. Tell me why in the comments below, why you thought this video sucked. I got big shoulders. Don't worry about it, man. That's about it. I hope you have a great day. Straight shooting. Take care.